Thanks, Jenny. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I see that we've got close to 35 attendees, and that's a very good number for this webinar. We had a nice, productive webinar this morning as well. So I just wanted to say hi, say thank you for all you're doing, and emphasize a little bit how much we understand the importance of real and personal property data submission and the compliance review process. So James, thank you to you and your staff for putting this together. Good job this morning, and look forward to listening in on your afternoon session as well. So thanks everyone out there, and James, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Wes. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone. We would like to welcome you to the Department of Local Government Finance webinar about the Pay 22 real and personal property data submission process and the compliance reviews that the department conducts involving these data sets. My name is James Johnson, and I serve as the director of the DLGF's Data Analysis Division. Additionally, I am happy to have my fellow data team member, Marilyn Gosh James, co-presenting with me today. Marilyn is a tax data analyst, and in her role, conducts the real and personal property compliance review process, which will be discussed in greater detail during today's presentation. This webinar, which will last roughly an hour, will focus on two primary areas related to real property assessment and personal property assessment data. First, the information covered in today's webinar will provide you with a greater understanding of what is contained within the data files that county assessors submit to the DLGF by the end of August each year. Second, we will discuss the compliance review process that the department conducts on the real and personal property assessment data during both the fall and spring. Please note that the focus of today's webinar is primarily on the assessment data that county assessors submit each year during the summer. That said, county auditors may find the information covered in today's webinar beneficial, since we will be highlighting the connection between the real and personal property assessment data and the property tax data as it relates to our compliance review process. One other quick item to note about today's webinar, and this is something that Jenny mentioned in her comments earlier. We very much welcome your questions. If you do have any questions that come up during today's presentation, please type those into the question box, which is at the bottom of your Teams window. If time allows, we'll try to address some of those questions at the end of today's webinar. Additionally, we'll be compiling the questions and the department's responses to those questions into a Q&A document that will be posted to the department's webinar page soon. So with that said, let's jump right on into our presentation. So in terms of any date or deadline that we would ask that you take away from today's presentation, the one date to keep in mind is August 31st. And the good thing is it's just there's one date for the various different data sets. So August 31st is the deadline for county assessors to submit to the DLGF their Pay 22 real property data files, their Pay 22 oil and gas assessment data files, and that pertains to only about 16 counties throughout the state. And then August 31st is also the deadline for county assessors to submit their personal property data files for Pay 22 to the DLGF. So again, only one date to remember in this presentation, and that is August 31st. That's the deadline for submitting your data files to the state. So let's talk a bit about the real property data files that you submit to the DLGF on an annual basis during the summertime. So the process for submitting the data files in terms of a best practice, right after the county assessor rolls their values to the auditor's office and the county auditor's office has completed a successful roll and balance of the real property gross AVs, the county assessor should then email their real property data files to the state. And as part of that data submission, there are 7 files, which we'll talk about in a little more detail coming up in the next few slides. But those 7 files are the parcel file, land file, improved file, dwelling file, building detail file, and appeal file. Now, I mentioned as a best practice, the assessor's office should submit these files after the county auditor's office has confirmed that they've completed a successful balance of those values. We don't recommend that county assessors submit their files prior to this process. The reason being is if there were an error that was discovered during the roll and balancing process, that might require the county assessor to go back, make corrections to their files, and then do another roll over to the auditor's office. Well, if you've already submitted your data files before getting confirmation from the auditor's office that you successfully balanced, then you would have to then regenerate another set of data files to send to us after you do that re-roll. So we simply recommend that county assessors hold off on sending their data files to the state until the auditor's office has confirmed that they balanced those files in their office. Now, that said, as soon as that balance process has been successfully completed, then county assessors should submit their data files to the DLGF. The deadline, as we just referenced on the previous slide, is August 31st. But if you've already rolled and balanced your real property assessed values, let's say by July 1st, which is the deadline, there really is no reason to hold off on delaying submitting those files to the state. Go ahead and email the files to the department's data inbox. The address is data@dlgf.in.gov. That way, you'll still have the roll and balancing process at the forefront of your mind. It's something that you could get done, checked off your list, and you don't have to worry about going potentially 2 months to the very end of August and having forgot that you didn't submit the files to the DLGF. So right after the auditor's office has confirmed that they balanced those values, we would recommend that the county assessors go ahead and email your real property data files to the state. And again, they go to the department's data inbox, data@dlgf.in.gov. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of the data files that make up the real property data submission. There are a total of 7 files, and this slide kind of gives you the lay of the land with how the files all connect. At the very top level is the parcel file. The parcel file is kind of the king of the hill, if you will. It sits at the very top level, and it provides an overall inventory, a complete inventory of all real property parcels, I should say active real property parcels for your county. And then on the next rung down, you'll see 2 files there, the land and improve. What those 2 files do is simply take the parcel file, the information pertaining to the parcels in the parcel file, and break those parcels down into further detail based on their land information and their improvement information. And then on the third rung down, right below the improve file, the data that's contained in the improve file is then broken down further into another set of files. You have a file that's dedicated to providing information related to residential dwellings, and then you have a file that's dedicated to providing additional detail for your commercial or industrial buildings, all that which are included in the improved file. And then finally, on the last rung there at the very bottom, there is an additional data file pertaining to commercial and industrial buildings, and that's the building detail file. And that simply takes the information contained in the building file and breaks the data down further based on individual floors for a building. And then finally, off to the side, off to the far right, you'll see an appeal file. It kind of sits alone, but what that file is simply a list of all active appeal records associated with the real property parcels in a county. So let's talk a little bit in detail about the 7 different data files that make up the real property data submission. The first, and probably the most important of them all, is the parcel file. And the parcel file, what it does is provide a complete listing or inventory of all active real property parcels in the county. The parcel file is going to provide information such as the property address for each parcel, the property owner information, both prior year and current year assessed value for each parcel, and along with the total assessed values provided, it's going to show how the AV allocations are set for each parcel. So if a parcel has 1% homestead land and improvement, it will show that. If it has 2% farmland, it will show that value. If it has 3% commercial industrial improvement or land values, it will show that amount. And as we were just referencing on the previous slide, the parcel file sits atop the data hierarchy. In other words, all the other real property data files that are included in your submission, they must contain at least one instance of a parcel number that matches back to a parcel number in the parcel file. Because again, the parcel file is going to provide the master list of parcel numbers for all active parcels in your county for that particular assessment cycle. So right below the parcel file, when referencing the chart that we were just looking at a moment ago, there is the land file. And the land file simply takes the information that's in the parcel file, and as it pertains specifically to the land values, and breaks that information down into further detail. So the land file is going to provide a complete listing of all land records for your real property data set. It's possible for any given parcel in your county to have multiple land records, which it's dependent upon how the land is actually divided or used. So a common example would be, let's say you have parcel that has a homestead on it, and then it also has farmland on it. Well, that particular parcel may have multiple land records because it's going to have a land record for its home site, and then it's going to have at least one record for the agricultural land that's associated with that parcel. The land file is going to contain will contain data points such as the land type, so how each land record is being used. It will have the base rate information, so the actual rate for which the land's being priced at, the size dimensions of the land records, such as acreage or square foot, and influence factors, and of course, it will have the assessed value for each land record provided. And the last bullet point on this slide, again, going back to our data hierarchy, any instance of a parcel number that's in the land file, it must match back to a parcel number that shows up in the parcel file, again, because the parcel file contains the master list of all parcel numbers in the county. So on that same level as the land file, there is the improved file. So both these files are on that second rung, if you will, of the pyramid. The improved file, similar to the land file, will provide a complete inventory of all real property improvement records related to the parcels in the county. So it's possible for a parcel to have either no improvement records if it's a vacant parcel. It could have one improvement record. Let's say if you just have a very simple homestead on the property and that's it, or it could have multiple improvement records. So if you have a parcel that has the person's dwelling, it has a detached garage, it has a pool, it has a pole barn, that one parcel will have multiple records in the improved file associated with it. The improved file contains information such as the type of improvement, so whether it's a dwelling, if it's a pole barn, if it's a pool, if it's a gas station, fast food restaurant, things like that. It will contain information for the grade, the condition, the size, the year the improvement was built, and also very importantly, it will contain the assessed value for each specific improvement. And just like we were referencing in the land file, in the improved file, any instance of a parcel number in the improved file must tie back to a match in the parcel file. Again, because the parcel file contains the master list of all parcel numbers for active real properties in the county. So right below the improved file, on that third rung of our real property data hierarchy or pyramid, is the dwelling file. And what the dwelling file does is simply take information in the improved file right above it and break down that information for residential dwellings. So the dwelling file is going to contain a complete listing of all residential dwelling improvements in the county. And it's possible for a parcel to have either no dwellings, if it's a vacant parcel, it wouldn't have a dwelling, or if it's maybe a commercial or industrial parcel that doesn't have a residential dwelling, that it would not have a dwelling record. It could have one dwelling, or it could have potentially multiple dwelling records associated with it. The dwelling file will contain information such as the story height for the dwelling, the number of finished rooms, the size of the dwelling, and value adjustments for items such as air conditioning and garages. And again, referencing our data hierarchy here, any instance of a parcel number in the dwelling file, there must be a corresponding match to that parcel number in both the improved file, which is right above it, and the parcel file, which again is at the very top of the pyramid. And on the same level as the dwelling file, there is a data file called the building file. And what the building file does is simply take the information in the improved file right above it and break that information down into further detail for commercial and industrial building records. So the building file pertains exclusively to commercial and industrial, whereas the dwelling file was exclusive to residential properties. So the building file, in that particular data file, a parcel can have either no building records associated with it. It could have one building record, or it could have multiple building records, again, depending on how the parcel is actually set up. The building file will contain information such as the predominant use of the building, the number of floors, the size of the building, and the total base value for the building. And again, any instance of a parcel number in the building file, that must match back to parcel number in the improved file right above it, and the parcel file right above the improved file. So again, that's how everything ties back together within the data hierarchy for real property assessment. And then finally, at the very bottom rung of our pyramid, we have the building detail file. The building detail file is going to provide a complete inventory of all commercial industrial building detail records. And the building detail file can have either no, I should say a parcel can either have no records in the building detail file, it can have one record in that file, or it can have multiple building detail records. What the building detail file does is basically takes the information contained in the building file, which sits right above it in that third level, and then breaks the information down for that building by specific floor. So it's going to give you information for how each floor of that commercial or industrial building is being used. And again, stressing the point of the data hierarchy here, any instance of a parcel number in the building detail file must have a match in the parcel file, improved file, and building file. And then finally, the last data file that makes up the real property data submission is the appeal file. The appeal file simply provides a complete listing of all active appeal records related to real property parcels in the county. Any given parcel can have either no appeal records, can have one appeal record, or multiple appeal records if there's potentially active appeals that are carrying across from multiple years on that property. The appeal file contains information such as the petitioner's contact information, the grounds for appeal, so why the petitioner is appealing their assessed value. It will contain the original value of the property and the revised value of the property. And again, stressing the connection here between the appeal file and the parcel file. Any instance of a parcel number in the appeal file must have a corresponding match in the parcel file. So that is a description of the 7 different data files that make up your real property data submission. So let's talk now about the compliance review process that the department's data team conducts on the real property data we receive from the counties. So our compliance review process basically takes place in 2 different phases. There is a primary review of the real property data that we conduct in the fall, shortly after we receive the data from the counties. And then we do a secondary review of the real property assessment data again in the spring. And that review, that secondary review, basically compares the information in the real property assessment data to the records in the county auditor's property tax data they submit in the spring. So one thing that we want to stress or highlight in terms of the compliance review process that is an adjustment or a change from last year to this year. Some of you may recall that for the Pay 21 review cycle, the department used a 5% tolerance as its threshold for deeming whether or not a county's real property data would be deemed as pending/compliant, or if it would be deemed non-compliant. That means that basically when we were looking at your Pay 21 real property data this past year, if we ran your data through one of our compliance checks and one of those checks resulted in a number of records where the total assessed value for those records exceeded 5% of the total gross AV for your county's real property, then we would deem your county's data, your real property data, as non-compliant. So 5% was the tolerance we used last year for the Pay 21 data. This year, the tolerance will be lowered. It actually will drop down to 3%. So for the Pay 22 review cycle, the tolerance level that we're going to be using to make our determination on whether the data is pending / compliant or not compliant will be 3%. So when the data team completes its review of the county's real property data, it's going to email the county with 2 documents containing its findings. One of the documents that the county will receive is the real property issues workbook, and that is an Excel file that will provide the itemized breakdown of the records that when we ran the data through our compliance checks, those particular records generated possible or probable errors based on our compliance checks. And then we will also submit or provide a real property compliance report. This document is normally sent in a PDF attachment to the email. And the compliance report simply provides the summary analysis of the checks that we performed on the data, and most importantly, gives the official compliance status, whether it's going to be pending, compliant, or not compliant. So a couple things to note about the real property issues workbook that counties will receive. The issues workbook is, again, it's an Excel file, and it will have multiple tabs. Each tab on that workbook is going to pertain to a specific check that we performed, that we ran with your real property assessment data. And the other thing to note about the real property issues workbook, so the county assessors will receive an issues workbook in the fall after we complete our fall review, and they'll receive the issues workbook in the spring after we complete our spring review. Well, the issues workbook the county will receive in the spring likely will have more tabs associated with it, simply because as part of our spring review, we're doing additional data checks that are comparing the real property data to the property tax data. So there's just going to be more items to provide. So your spring issues workbook will likely have more tabs than your fall issues workbook. That said, all the tabs that you have on your fall workbook that you'll receive later this year, those same tabs, that same information will show up on your spring issues workbook. So those tabs will essentially be repeated when you receive your spring issues workbook. It's just that the spring issues workbook will have additional data tabs because of the additional data checks we run in the spring. Now, in terms of the actual items or checks that we run on the real property data, we have a list of items that we perform, or the checks that we perform on the data. One of them is the AV allocation check, and you'll notice that we have this marked with an asterisk. That's simply because this check is really informational. It doesn't carry with it an official compliant or non-compliant status. We simply provide this check as a way for county assessors to look at some of the records that when we ran the data through our review process, the property class code seemed a little bit off compared to how the AV allocations were set for that parcel. Now, we're very mindful that the property class code / AV check is not an exact science. It's more of an art, particularly when it comes to the issue of mixed-use properties. This check does not really account for that example of mixed-use properties. So that's really why this check is done on an informational basis instead of like factoring into our decision of whether or not we're going to deem the data as pending, compliant, or non-compliant. The other checks that we perform on the real property data, we look at the parcel number format to verify that each parcel number in the parcel file is following the state 18-digit format. We look for duplicate parcel numbers in your data set, verifying that there aren't any instances of duplicate parcel numbers, because again, the parcel file should contain a master list of all real property parcels, and that should be each instance of a parcel in the parcel file should be unique. There should not be any duplicate situations of a parcel being repeated in the parcel file. We look for valid state assigned district checks, verifying that the state assigned district that's assigned with a real property parcel matches the actual district, taxing district in the parcel number itself. We look for valid property class codes, being sure that all parcels have a valid property class code associated with it. We do check on the property tax cap additions. This is simply looking at the parcel file. And within the parcel file, you're going to have a data point that pertains to the total land assessed value for that record. And then the land record is going to have its AV broken down by the 1%, 2%, 3% AV allocations. That check simply verifies that the values that are in the 1%, 2%, 3% land AV allocations sum up total the amount that's listed under the total land value. And we do a similar check for the improvement values as well. Carrying on with the other items that we perform as part of our compliance review process, we look for negative and non-numeric assessed values to verify that parcels don't contain negative assessed values. That wouldn't make any sense. We look for matching parcel numbers in the land file to verify that instances of parcel numbers in the land file are matching back to a parcel number in the parcel file. Again, this ties back to the data hierarchy that we were talking about earlier. We look for matching parcel numbers in the improved file and verify that those references match back to parcel numbers in the parcel file. We do a number of checks on the improvement AV adjustment and land AV adjustments. So those checks simply look at the values for records in the land file, take the value for that land record in the land file, and then apply the land AV adjustment that's in the parcel file to verify that when you take the land value in the land file and factor in the land AV adjustment in the parcel file, that's going to sum up to the total land value for that parcel in the parcel file. If it doesn't, then that item will show up as an issue for this particular check. And we do a similar process for the improvement records as well. Another item that we perform on the real property data is a look for any blank property address and owner names. This particular check actually was an item that caused several counties last year for the Pay 21 cycle to be deemed non-compliant because they exceeded the 5% tolerance that we allow for our checks. Essentially, the idea behind this check is that if a real property parcel has an assessed value greater than 0, so it's going to get a tax bill because its assessed value is something that is, it's going to be taxed on, then that address, that parcel should have at a bare minimum a city, state, and zip code associated with it. You should not have a parcel in your data set that is missing its property address information. If it has an assessed value greater than 0, it's going to, that parcel is going to receive a tax bill. So this is what that check actually looks for. Again, the standard that we're using at a minimum is that each parcel in your real property data set should have at a minimum a city, town, state, and zip code associated with it. Ideally, it's going to have the complete address. So you're going to have a complete street address associated with it as well. But at a minimum, it needs to have a city, town, state, and zip associated with it. Another check that we run is look for the government-owned parcels. These are parcels that have a property class code in the 600 to 669 series. And basically, these parcels, since they're government-owned, when they are rolled from the assessor's office to the auditor's office, their assessed value should be 0. So in this check, we're looking for these parcels that actually have this property class code, but have a value greater than 0. So those particular items would show up for this particular check. And then on the flip side of that, we look for non-government owned exempt parcels. These are parcels that have a property class code in the 670 through 699 range. So for this particular item, we would expect that these records would actually have an assessed value greater than 0 when they're rolled from the assessor's office to the auditor's office. And then when they get imported into the auditor's tax and billing system, the auditor's office will then apply an exemption code that will reduce the assessed value for that record. But starting off, when they're rolled from the assessor's office to the auditor's office, they should have an assessed value greater than 0. And then we do a number of checks that look at the classified land and the legally deeded acreage. These checks are a comparison between the land file and the parcel file. So for any instances of classified land in the land file, we're going to look for the AV of that land in the land file and see how it compares to the classified land AV data field in the parcel file for that same record. And then for the legally deeded acreage, again, we're looking at the various records, land records in the land file, seeing what the acreage is for those records, and then comparing it to what is listed for the legally deeded acreage for the same parcel in the parcel file. And then finally, as part of our spring review, and again, this is exclusive to the spring review process itself, we're going to look for differences in gross assessed values between records in the parcel file versus the auditor's property tax data file. And we're going to also look for any discrepancies where there may be records in one data set but not in the other. But again, those two last items only pertain to the spring review process, not to the fall. So in terms of an official status, when we get to the end of our review process, there are three possible outcomes. The one that you want to try to avoid at all costs, if possible, is the non-compliant status. Basically, if we deem your data as non-compliant, that means that we're going to send the report to you with the non-compliant status, and then we're going to ask you to take a look at the items on your issues workbook, make the necessary corrections for that particular review cycle, and then resubmit your data to us after you made the corrections. And then we're going to conduct another round of reviews on that data set for that particular pay year. So again, this is the data sets this is the status that you want to try to avoid if at all possible. In terms of our fall review process, what status the county assessor should be striving for is a pending status. So again, the pending status is relevant to only the fall review, and that's basically meaning that when you get your compliance email from the data team, if you have a pending status, you do not need to make corrections and resubmit your data for that particular review cycle. You basically are kind of given a green light for the fall review. That said, for the issues workbook that we're going to provide you as part of our analysis, we highly recommend that you take a look at the items in that issues workbook and make any necessary corrections to those records in the issues workbook. So that way, when you submit your data next year for the Pay 23 cycle, those same issues will not carry forward for the Pay 23 submission cycle. And then finally, the last status that a county can have for our compliance review process is a compliance status. Compliant is a status applicable only to the spring review. So whereas pending was applicable to the fall review, compliant is applicable only to the spring review process. And that's essentially the status that county assessors want to aim for. This means that when you get your compliance report from the data team, you do not need to go back and make any corrections to your data and resubmit it for another round of reviews for that cycle. But as we were just referencing for the pending status, you'll get an issues workbook that will have items that generated possible or probable errors when we ran the items through the data through our checks. We very much encourage you, ask you to review those records, and if you need to make any necessary corrections to those items, please do so before you submit your data to us next year for the Pay 23 data submission process. That way, those errors will not carry forward for the next data cycle. Now, a couple of things to note that are new for the Pay 22 review cycle coming up this fall. As I noted in a few slides earlier, we are going to be adjusting our tolerance for our real property assessment checks, whereas for the Pay 21 data, we had a 5% tolerance. For the Pay 22 real property assessment data, that tolerance will be lowered to 3%. So basically that means that for checks that we run on real property assessment data, if there are records that are generated through from one of these checks, and the assessed value for those particular records, if that exceeds 3% of your county's total gross AV for real property, then your data will be deemed non-compliant. Again, last year it was 5%. This year we're lowering it down to 3%. In addition to that change in tolerance level, we're also making adjustment to, or I should say we're adding several new checks for the Pay 22 review cycle. The new checks that we're adding pertain to to the data files. They pertain to the land file and the improved file. For the land file, a couple of the new checks that we're adding is looking for invalid land type codes in the land file. So this is looking for codes in the land file based on how your land records are being used or assigned. So we're looking for invalid entries in that field. We're also looking for property tax cap additions in the land file. So for each land record in the land file, there is a data point that points to the total assessed value for that land record, and then there are data points that break that information down by the 1, 2, 3% AB allocations. For this check, we're simply verifying that the values listed under the 1, 2, 3% AB allocations, that those total equal the amount that's shown under the total assessed value for that land record. We're also doing a check that looks for land records that have an AB on them but contain no size dimensions. So basically, if there's a land record in the land file that has an assessed value greater than 0, but there is nothing provided in terms of any size dimensions. So there's no effective frontage, no effective depth, no acreage, no square footage. So these items will generate an issue or generate a record when we run the data through our checks. And then for the improved file, we're adding a new check, very similar to the land file for the property tax cap additions. The improved file has a field provides the total assessed value for an improvement record, and then there are additional data points that break the improvement down by the 1, 2, 3% AB allocations. We simply verify that the amounts listed under the 1, 2, 3% AB allocations equal the amount that's shown under the total value for that improvement record. And then we're also looking for any records that have a missing condition code or missing grade in the improved file. Now, one important thing to stress about these new checks that we're adding for the Pay 22 review cycle, for any of these new checks that I just referenced in the previous slide or two, if we run the data through our compliance review process and we see a number of records that error out that generate issues, if those records, if they end up exceeding our 3% tolerance, we are not going to mark your data as not compliant. Instead, we will issue a warning for the Pay 22 data. And what we would ask is that you take a look at these items on your issues workbook and then determine what corrections may be needed to those records, make those corrections in time before you submit your data for the Pay 23 cycle so that these records do not carry forward for the Pay 23 data submission cycle. So again, any of these new items, these new checks that were just discussed, if they happen to exceed the 3% tolerance level for this upcoming review cycle, they will not result in your county's data being rejected or being deemed non-compliant. Instead, they will be treated as a warning for this particular review cycle. But please review those items and make any necessary corrections so that they don't carry over for the Pay 23 data submission cycle. And then finally, one item that I wanted to point out that's similar to I was just referencing about these new checks, we're also going to be treating the invalid improvement type code check as a warning item for the Pay 22 data cycle or data review cycle. This is not a new check. We've actually been running this invalid improvement type code check for a number of years now. But the reason why we are going to treat this as a warning instead of a potential rejection item is because we are currently working with the department's assessment division and the CAMA software vendors on making updates to our improvement type code list so that hopefully by next cycle, any of records that would air out as part of this check would be caught and would not be deemed as an issue for your Pay 23 data. So we're going to provide this information to you for the invalid improvement type code check as a warning for Pay 22. But again, we would ask that you review these items and make any necessary corrections in advance of submitting your Pay 23 data to us next year. So with that said, I'm going to turn the presentation over now to my colleague, Marilyn Gosh James, and she's going to talk about the personal property assessment data and the compliance review process we conduct on the data.
Great. Thank you, James. Good afternoon, everybody. So the personal property assessment data. So the personal property assessment data submission process. This is similar to the real property assessment data submission process. When the county assessor's office roll their values to the county auditor's office, they should notify the state of rolling of their values by emailing data@dlgf.in.gov. This is vice versa when the county auditor balanced the personal property gross assessed values with the county assessor's office to notify the state of the balancing of the personal property gross assessed values by emailing the department. The county assessor must confirm the complete and a successful roll and balance before sending the personal property assessment data, which includes the PERSPROP, pool data, and appeal PP to the state. Best practice to keep in mind once that the county completed a successful roll and balance that the county assessor has confirmed is to go ahead and send the personal property data files instead of waiting till the August 31st deadline. So as soon as the department receives the personal property data files, we forward those files to the legislative service agency right away. Now let's talk about the personal property assessment data hierarchy, comparing the personal property assessment data hierarchy to the real property hierarchy. The personal property only has three, which are the PERSPROP pool data and appeal PP data files. Top is the PERSPROP file. This is the main inventory of all personal property filings within the county. The second rundown is the pool data file. This provides a breakdown of the pool schedule information for the personal property filing. Then to the third rundown is the to the right that sits alone is the appeal PP files. This provides the inventory of all the active appeal records for the personal property filings in the county. Now, in terms of the PERSPROP file, a complete inventory of all the personal property returns filed in the county, including those records that are the business personal property exempt eligible. The file contains data points such as property address, taxpayer information, current year assessed value information, and the principal business activity code for each personal property records. The PERSPROP file sits atop the assessment data hierarchy. The other personal property data files must contain at least one instance of a personal property number that matches back to a property number in a PERSPROP file. Now, in terms of the pool data file, a complete inventory of all pooling schedule data related to the personal property returns filed in the county. And any given personal property record can have multiple pooling schedule records, and in other words, pool 1 through pool 4, depending on how the personal property return was completed. Now, the file contains data points such as pool number, acquisition start, and end date, total cost, or and adjusted cost entered tax value. Any instance of a property number in the pool data file must have a corresponding match in the PERSPROP file, but it's important to note that not all PERSPROP records will have a value in the pool data file. It is important to note that certain records that has a special tooling associated with them, and those particular records don't have a corresponding pool data match. And often when we have a situation like this, we have the county provide a separate list of their special tooling records that will not have the information between the pool data file. In terms of the appeal PP, a complete inventory of all active appeal records related to the personal property records in the county. Any given personal property record can have no records, one record, or multiple appeal records. The file contains data points such as petitioner's contact information, grounds for appeal, original value, and revised value. Any instance of a property number in an appeal PP file must have a corresponding match in a PERSPROP file. So that is a detailed description of the 3 data files to make up the personal property data submission. Now, let's talk about the actual personal property data compliance process that the department conducts in the personal property data. The personal property compliance review process is similar to the real property compliance review. The compliance review process takes place in two phases. One is the primary review of the data set itself conducted in the fall, shortly after the county has submitted its data. And second is the secondary review of the data set, comparing records to the auditor's property tax data conducted in spring after the property tax data has been submitted. Now, last year, the department used a 5% tolerance to determine the county's personal property data submission of the pending status, compliant or non-compliant status. So, but this year, for the paid 2022 review cycle, the tolerance will be at 3%. Note that this is similar to the real property documents that the county received with its findings. When a department completes its review of a county's personal property data, it emails the county 2 documents with its finding. First is a personal property issues workbook, and this is provided in Excel format. Provides an itemized breakdown of the records that contain probable errors or possible errors based on our compliance checks. The second one is the personal property compliance report, which is provided to the county in a PDF format. It provides a summary statistical analysis of the submitted data and an official compliance status. The personal property issues workbook contains multiple tabs, which provide a list of personal property records that generated errors, either certain or possible. When the data was run through the various compliance checks, the personal property issues workbook sent after the review in the spring will likely contain more tabs than the workbook sent in the fall, since the spring review includes a comparison between the personal property and abstract data. So similar to the real property compliance review, when the county assessor received their issues workbook in the spring, it will have all exact tabs information that they receive in the fall. As far as the fall review process, but it will also contain additional tabs when we do the secondary review. We'll have the personal property assessment data, the property tax data, and the 7 additional checks that I will cover in a little bit. So the compliance review process of the personal property data includes the following checks, which is the check for property record number format. As this is required, the first 2 digits must have the county code, and another requirement that the property number must be unique. The pool data file format. This is we check for the 4 different pool schedule, and the acquisition start and end dates are valid within the pool data file. The checks for valid NAIC's codes. We check for principal business activity code, verifying the pooling that must have the current NAIC as code. Now, the code list is available on the U.S. Census Bureau website. We also check for the valid taxpayer types. This verifies the number of business taxpayer type codes in the file records, and also the valid taxpayer type codes. The PERSPROP and pool data matching records check. We verify that the applicable records are special to link, and all records in the pool data file must match the records in the PERSPROP file. The gross assessed value in PERSPROP greater than the total cost in pool data check. It's verifying that the gross assessed value in the PERSPROP file may not be higher than the maximum of the adjusted cost in the pool data file. And PERSPROP file versus tax data file, which is only during this spring review. This is a comparison of missing records in the PERSPROP file versus the auditor's tax data files. And the second is the discrepancies in gross assessed values between the PERSPROP and property tax data file. And in terms of the official status issued at the end of the personal property compliance review process, there are 3 possible outcomes, which is the non-compliant status, depending status, and compliance status. Now, if a county's personal property data is deemed non-compliant status, the county must review the errors, make any necessary correction, and resubmit its data for another round of reviews. During the fall review, the county's goal or should achieve is to be at the pending status. No further action is required by the county assessor in terms of correcting and resubmitting the data files. However, the county assessor's staff should still review the items included in the issues workbook, that is an Excel spreadsheet, and determine if any correction should be made before submitting the PAY 2023 data assessment files for next year. Excuse me. If a county's personal property data is deemed compliant, which is a status only applicable to the spring review, no further action is required by the county assessor in terms of correcting and resubmitting data files. And however, the county assessor staff should still review the items included in the issues workbook and determine what corrections should be made before submitting the PAY 2023 assessment files. Now, for the PAY 2022 review cycle, the department will be using a 3% tolerance when reviewing the personal property data. In other words, if the total assessed value from the list of records for a particular check exceeds 3% of the county's total personal property gross assessed value, the data set will be deemed non-compliant. This is referencing to the checks we have been performing for a number of review cycles. Starting with the PAY 2022 review cycle, the following new compliance checks will be incorporated into the review process. These items are the checks for PERSPROP file, missing taxpayer address information. Note this information is critical and that it should have the complete mailing address. We check for the PERSPROP file missing form type. These form types are the form 102, 103 short, and 103 long. Next is the PERSPROP file missing return type code check. We check for the return type code original, fourth, and amendment return type codes. The check for PERSPROP file missing filing date. We check for when the returns are filed to the county. Check for the missing personal property taxpayer unique ID. We check for one unique business personal property filer who may have multiple returns in certain county. We check for the PERSPROP file email tax bill requested, but no email address provided. It is important that the taxpayer should have an email address if they requested for an email tax bill. Last is we check for the PERSPROP file BPPE qualified with an SS value greater than 0, and we check this and it should be at 0. So if a county's PAY 2022 data submission should exceed the 3% tolerance for any of these new checks, the department will treat the applicable records as a warning item instead of deeming the data as non-compliant. So, however, the county assessor staff should still review the items included in the issues workbook and determine what corrections may be needed to the applicable records so that the same issue will not be repeated in the data submission cycle the following year and risk being deemed non-compliant. And it's also important to note that if the same issues appears in the upcoming PAY 2023 cycle and the county exceeds the 3% tolerance, then they will be deemed non-compliant.
All right, thank you, Marilyn. Thank you for discussing the personal property data submission and compliance review process. I know we're getting close to the end of our time here, but I did want to briefly touch on the oil and gas assessment data. This particular part of the presentation will only pertain to about 16 counties throughout the state. So it's a minority of the counties in Indiana. Most of them are down in the southwest corner of Indiana. So, but I did want to highlight some of the information for oil and gas assessment data submission. It's very similar to the process for submitting your real property and personal property. So after the county assessor has rolled their oil and gas assessment data to the county auditor's office, and the auditor's office has confirmed, has completed a successful balance of those values, then the assessor should email their oil and gas assessment data file to the state. There are only 2 files as part of this data submission, the oil and gas all files. Both those data files should be emailed to the department's data inbox at data@dlgf.in.gov. And again, as I was just talking about earlier, there are only 2 data files that make up an oil and gas data submission. The oil and gas file, which is kind of in the data hierarchy, sits at the top of the pyramid there, at the top of the structure, and then the oil and gas all file is right below it. The oil and gas file is going to provide a complete inventory of all the oil and gas leases in a given county. It's going to contain information such as what type of well was it? Was it an oil and gas well? The acreage for that particular record, the average daily production for the oil and gas well, the total assessed value, and any appurtenance value. And then the oil and gas all file, which is right below the oil and gas file. What that file contains is information pertaining to the individual interest owners in the oil and gas lease. So it's going to have information such as the interest type, whether that's a working or royalty interest, the interest factor, the calculated assessment for each individual interest owner in that lease, and the contact information for the individual interest owners. So again, the oil and gas assessment data is applicable to only about 16 counties throughout the state, but we did want to actually highlight that again, you want to get these data files submitted to us on or before August 31st. That's the deadline for submitting your oil and gas assessment data. But if you already have rolled and balanced your oil and gas data to the auditor's office has confirmed that, then go ahead, county assessors, and email those data files to us. All right, so we have come to the end of our presentation today. Unfortunately, we don't really have time for questions since we're right at 3 o'clock. But if you do have any questions, please feel free to email that. As I just said, if you happen to have a question related to today's presentation, please email that question. Our contact information is shown on the screen here. You can also email those questions to the data inbox. Again, the data inbox email address is data@dlgf.in.gov. Also, we will be posting today's PowerPoint presentation, the Q&A document for any questions that we received, webinar survey, and the continuing education credit form for today's session to the department's webinar page. The department will also be sending out a separate email with a link to this information as well. So with that said, we would like to thank everyone once again for attending today's webinar and wish everyone a great rest of their day. Thank you very much.